Today's program is All Aboard for Redlands, How the Railroad Shaped Our Town. So what I want to argue today is that climate, land, water, transportation, citrus, and tourism all came together to create Redlands. If you remove any one of those things, then we have no Redlands, at least not a Redlands as we know it. The program may seem a bit disjointed because there are several stories unfolding in parallel. For this talk, I'm going to focus obviously exclusively on really one of those, which is the transportation and how it impacts the others. But I want to also start with a look at the national context of railroad development. So if you're ready, we'll head all aboard, and we're going to start by launching a video that shows the growth of railroads in the United States. Business Insider did a really great job with that video, and I think it puts a lot of context into the national scene. Let's go back to the very kind of beginning of the railroad story for California. And that's that because of the enormous expense of building railroad lines, the Pacific Railroad Acts passed by Congress during the Lincoln administration for the purpose of constructing a transcontinental railroad, as well as subsequent legislation, created a system where railroads were given large tracts of land as incentive and to help offset costs. The tracts were granted in a checkerboard pattern, as you can see here. But so for a little bit of temporal context, here's our first poll, and if you were paying attention during the video, you will already know the answer. So here we go. In what year was the first transcontinental railroad completed? 1865, 1869, 1876, or 1877? It looks like you guys are doing pretty well. See if we'll give you guys the last couple seconds if anyone hasn't voted yet who would like to. and we'll hit it there. So 80% of those who polled said 1869, and that is absolutely the correct answer. So thank you very much for that. Okay. So once the Transcontinental Railroads connected California, a number of new railroads sprouted up, and Southern Pacific, which had been part of, well, the Central Pacific was the western section of the first Transcontinental Railroad and then pushed south basically from San Francisco. We get down into Southern California, and SP had a big push to try to get to Yuma, Arizona. And they came through San Mateo Canyon here in Redlands in 1875 and finally made it to Yuma in 1876. So you can see San Bernardino is a big deal there. Interestingly, when Southern Pacific was coming in, they wanted to go through San Bernardino, and they asked for a significant number of concessions from the city, and the city said, absolutely not. So Southern Pacific decided, all right, we're gonna go around you, and they created the city of Colton instead. So Colton exists because San Bernardino wouldn't make a deal. So here's the train coming through San Mateo Canyon, out towards today's Loma Linda on the west and further on. And the Transcontinental Railroads allowed long distance travel across land like never before. Rate wars between competing railroads in the 1880s lowered prices drastically. Land speculation became the norm, tracts were bought and sold, and that created a boom in Southern California that saw numerous new towns spring up, many of which would bust with the financial panic of 1893. In the 1870s and early 1880s, Redlands and Ligonia were competing towns. Now, Ligonia began in the 1870s, and Redlands by Ed Judson and Frank Brown in 1881. Both groups knew success depended upon the railroad. With the influence of the Chicago colony, who came in 1886, the town plat for today's downtown core was laid out, doubtless in anticipation of railroad necessity. In early 1887, Santa Fe decided on a route that would run just north of the Sankey. That's right, I said Sankey, not Zanja. Z-A-N-J-A is the common academic way we talk about that. But Redlanders, as you know, if you're familiar with Redlands history, for whatever reason, we call it the Sankey. And you can actually see the Sankey depicted in this 1882 bird's eye view. It runs from right to left through the middle, and it's that little kind of meandering thing that is depicted by a density of trees. Land that may be of limited value suddenly can become very valuable once it's accessible by the railroad. The coming of the railroad would assure prosperity to whichever town was successful, and here we have a financial incentive that was put together by Ligonia interests. They wanted the railroad to come through the Ligonia part of town. And the total on there, if you look, it's going to be a quite significant sum. The largest donor, Wilson and Berry, who were developers, were contributing $10,000 toward the railroad effort. Now, $10,000 in 1887 is roughly $250,000 today. Or if you look at the 1,000, that's about $25,000. So there were some Ligonia people who were interested in committing pretty significant funds toward the railroad effort. Of the coming of the railroad, the San Bernardino Daily Courier wrote in June 1887, "This meaneth much for the whole San Bernardino Valley, more for San Bernardino City, most of all for Redlands, Ligonia, and Crafton. It means that the whole eastern end of the San Bernardino Valley will be settled immediately. It means that a large country town will rapidly rise in the center of East San Bernardino, a town perhaps destined within 5 years to be the second in size, wealth, and importance in San Bernardino County. This town will cluster around, or rather on both sides of Mill Creek, and will extend from Ligonia Terrace on the north, southward along the Rutledge and Allen Link, and on the Wilson Tract on the opposite side of the street to the southern boundary of Redlands, which has already made splendid strides towards attaining the size and rank of a handsome country town. Of course, the immediate advent of the railroad will greatly accelerate the growth of this spirited young town, just as it will promote the development of the surrounding country." And here, this is the Santa Fe, the first railroad that was able to lay track into town. And by doing so, it won the contest for a gift of free station grounds. So you can see in blue, that's the the line as it came into Redlands. Service to Redlands began February 13th, 1888, with the depot completed July 14th, 1888, and the loop through Mentone, depicted here in this close-up, across the Santa Ana River and on to Highland was completed January 17th, 1892. The original name of the Chamber of Commerce was the Redlands Board of Trade. That body organized on March 10th, 1888 in order to, quote, confer with officials of the railroad company with reference to the cost of running excursions from Los Angeles to this place. So the whole Chamber of Commerce today was born out of the desire to run railroad excursions to Redlands. And here in those earliest days of 1888, you can see that there were 3 trains out and 3 trains in each day. Now, in addition to the Santa Fe, which came in, also in 1888, the San Bernardino and Redlands Railroad completed its line. The right-of-way was completely within public roads to save on the cost of land acquisition, but made for a haphazard, indirect-looking way to get into town. So you can see that it's in the red, going along all those county roads, including Cottonwood Road, which is now Mission Road, right? And then back up to Citrus and into town. So here's that first bird's eye view again, where I showed you with the Santa Fe line. Let's add the San Bernardino and Redlands Railroad Depot and its line there. The Motor Road Depot was on Water Street. And this brings us to poll number 2. All right, so all you students of Redlands history, what is Water Street named today? Is it named Orange Street, Citrus Avenue, State Street, or Redlands Boulevard? And here you can see in this photograph that the narrow gauge motor road as it came into town was actually in that street. And its early station buildings faced the street. All right, we'll give you a couple more seconds if there's anyone else who'd like to cast their ballot. Okay. And 52% of those of you who voted got the answer correct. It is Redlands Boulevard. Of course, it's named Water Street at that time because it is along the Sankey where the water is. So excellent job, everyone there. Here's an early timetable from 1890 for this narrow gauge motor road. And you can see that we've got 5 trains each direction each day. So you can get from Redlands all the way up to San Bernardino. It took you a little while because of all those curves and streets, but it was certainly easier than walking. The San Bernardino and Redlands Railway was acquired by Southern Pacific in 1891. And shortly thereafter, the track between Redlands Junction, which is where the Southern Pacific was able to add its spur to come into Redlands. Today we call that Bryn Mawr, but that was Redlands Junction then. Between Redlands Junction and the city of Redlands, that track was rebuilt to allow standard gauge tracks. Now the narrow gauge of what they called the dinky, or the small train that you see on the screen now, was only 36 inches. It was 3 feet. But standard gauge trains are at 4 feet 8.5 inches. So it has a much wider wheelbase. And this allowed for both the narrow gauge trains and standard gauge trains to come into Redlands for service. One of the people who worked for that, who was an early Redlands pioneer, was a guy named Albert Osmond. And among many things that he did, he also worked for the San Bernardino and Redlands Railroad. And in the 1890s, he was voted through the San Bernardino Sun newspaper as the best railroad man in San Bernardino County. And his prize for that award was this pocket watch, which we have now at the library, and you'll be able to see in the future Museum of Redlands. Little train orders would come out, or reminders from the company to Osmond, while he was working. This is an interesting one. A guy got on a train and his ticket had already been punched, and so Osmond threw him off the train. And of course, what did he do? He went back to LA and got an attorney and had his attorney contact the railroad in order to have some restitution for what had happened to him. And of course, the agent is saying that he was put off the train for having a ticket which had been punched by mistake before it was sold to him by the agent, which I'm sure happened so frequently. But when you can get an attorney involved, I guess you can get a free ride. Here's another one from the superintendent. He says, while out on the motor road a few days since, I personally noticed that you struck the curbs very hard. You must slow down at these points or you will be always liable for accidents. In 1898, Southern Pacific finally built a brand new station in downtown Redlands. So you can see on the rails as they come in from the right to the left, which is facing east, the ones on the top right are the 3-foot narrow gauge tracks that are coming in, and then they're joining with the standard gauge tracks of the main Southern Pacific trains that were coming in. And if you are keen looking at the photograph, you can see the Finney block in the background, which is on Orange Street and still stands today. The San Bernardino and Redlands Railroad operated until 1915, but by that point, revenues had dropped so much because of other competition that the railroad was abandoned. Southern Pacific continued other passenger service for a while, but it too eventually stopped passenger service. And by the 1940s, it was being used as Pacific Electric office. You could buy Greyhound bus tickets and other tickets as well. And then it was finally demolished in 1968. Now, just to illustrate how important the railroad was to the development of Redlands, here are a couple examples. From this sale prospectus for a new subdivision called the Williams Tract, a ranch, quote, a rancho could not be better situated than this with regard to transportation, as it is crossed by the kite-shaped track of the Santa Fe Railroad, and there is a station named Gladista on the land. The Redlands Station of the Southern Pacific Railroad Redlands branch is only 1.5 miles away. And here, the Barton Ranch adds, we're certain to list among its many advantages that the Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe Railroad and a steam motor line pass on through the ranch. Brookside Station on the Southern Pacific Railroad is less than 1 mile from the ranch house. And Judson and Brown certainly knew the value of transportation, especially when trying to sell land uphill from downtown Redlands. A street railroad will be built offering easy access to the motor line, California Central Depot, Redlands City, and its suburbs. The Articles of Incorporation for the Redlands Street Railway were filed March 12, 1888. For 11 years, the Redlands Street Railway operated its mule-drawn car from its car barn on 5th Street, down to State, west to Orange Street, south to Cajon, south to Cypress, west to Center, south to Highland. For a few years, in the first part of the 1890s, another line ran from Cajon and Olive all of the way to Teresina, but that line was abandoned when the Teresina Hotel burned in 1895. So you can see in green now, added to the map, the horse-drawn or mule-drawn Redlands Street Railway. This photograph, where you can see the mule-drawn streetcar coming up Cajon Street, was taken from the tower of the Kingsbury School, as it was then called. Of course, now we call it Kingsbury Elementary. Here we are on East State Street, about mid-block between Orange and 5th. The building furthest right is now Emerson Farrar Jewelers. I really feel for the 2 mules that had to pull all of that weight uphill. Supposedly, the speed was slow enough that Phil Dreiser, the regular operator of the car, could pick up and deliver goods along his route. And here's the car making the turn south onto Orange Street from State. However, by 1899, new technology appeared on the scene in enough quantity: electricity. Redlands Street Railway electrified in 1899 and changed its routes slightly. The revised line traveled southwest on Cedar Avenue because you certainly couldn't have streetcars running down Highland. The line was completed December 23rd, 1899, just in time for Christmas. But an earthquake on Christmas Day that destroyed much of the cities of San Jacinto and Hemet drove the headlines off the front page of the facts. In 1900, there was an extension made to Teresina. Now, Albert Smiley initially objected to the extension, saying, quote, "If carried to our west entrance, the line would reach the city limits, and as there is land outside the limit for sale, it might result in the establishment of a saloon or other nuisance at that point, immediately adjoining our park." Remember, at this period of time, Redlands was a prohibitionist style town, and spirituous beverage was much discouraged, especially by teetotalers like the Smileys. And you can see that this extension along the bottom left-hand corner of the screen went right past Canyon Crest Park. So they were afraid that because in the county there were different laws regarding the consumption of spirituous beverage, that some kind of roadhouse might pop up and people could get on the trolley car, go into the county, enjoy themselves a little too much, and then make it back into Redlands. But whatever his objections, the line actually was built. The board of directors, no doubt wanting to have an easier way to get their golf bags and clubs up to the course, had an extension made to the country club in 1901. There was a fair amount of discussion about which route the line should take, because some people wanted it to run on Franklin Avenue, while others looked at Garden Street. But Garden Street actually won. Here you can see the Garden Street line on its way to the country club, just north of Elizabeth Street. And if you're driving down Garden today, on the west side of Garden, you can still see the road with that stone retaining wall on the left side of the screen. It's just south of the intersection with South Avenue. The building behind the streetcar here was called the Fisher Block, and it was built by the Fishers, who controlled the Redlands Street Railway and the Redlands Electric Light and Power Company. It was later offices for Southern California Edison, of which Redlands Electric Light and Power was one of the units that merged to form Edison. So here's back to that map again, and you can see where we were with the 1901 extension. In 1903, the Redlands Street Railway merged with the San Bernardino Valley Traction Company, which was also controlled by the Fishers, and that completed a new line between Redlands and San Bernardino that year. It also ran a new electric line down Olive Avenue to Teresina, enabling a loop through southwest Redlands. In addition to regular transportation, of course, tourism was important, and you can see here an excursion car, where in the beautiful climate of Southern California, you could sit in these open benches and take in the beauties, the sights of Redlands. There was a great story that ran on April 2nd, 1910 in the Redlands Review, because a guy who worked for the Review got on a streetcar on the last run of the night, which was at 10:46 p.m. And one of the operators said to the other, let's start and see whether we can find any jackrabbits or anything else at the country club. And the motorman said, well, yeah, or maybe a dead man, which of course aroused some curiosity. So the reporter says, well, what's that about? And the motorman responds, well, Loish, the guy who was operating the car, ran over a man just this side of Fremont Avenue on the last trip up. But it wasn't a real man, it was a fake, a dummy, a man of straw. My, but he was frightened. We were bowling along when suddenly I heard a yell and a quick putting on of the brakes. After the car stopped, he came back with a scared look on his face as if he'd seen a ghost. I asked him what the trouble was, and he replied that he had struck a man who was under the car. We went out to investigate, expecting to find a mangled form and a dead man. When, what do you think we found? Why, a bunch of straw, which had been framed up like a man. A jumper having been used, but I don't know what encased the dummy's legs. The motorman and conductor were, of course, relieved and started the car with light hearts. The motorman said the dummy looked exactly like a man stretched across the tracks, and that when he had struck a human being, who would almost certainly have been killed. Whether they found any jackrabbits at the country club, the review man did not go far enough to ascertain, but he knows that the motorman would dearly love to catch the boys who played the rather early but very successful April Fool joke on him. But he thinks it was a good one on him, and would probably tell the boys so. So the Sammartino Valley Traction Company was running all of these local lines within the city, as well as connecting the city of San Bernardino with Redlands. And here you can get a sense of all the different places that you could go and how often, and think that we were only a town of 4,000 or 5,000 people at this time. So that's a fair amount of transit opportunity. Well, by 1908, the Fishers, who had been outflanked in a 1905 hostile takeover of the board of the San Bernardino Valley Traction Company, had created a second electric railway in town, and they called it the Redlands Central Railway. And that's what you can see here in the kind of purplish color. It operated along Brookside and Citrus Avenues from the western city limit at Tennessee to the eastern city limit at Wabash. But within a year, they sold that company to Henry Huntington. This car barn was built for the Redlands Central Railway and is now an auto repair shop on Citrus between Redlands Boulevard and Church Street. So you can see that by 1908, Redlands was served by two major steam railroads, the Santa Fe and the Southern Pacific, and two electric railways, the San Bernardino Valley Traction Company and Redlands Central Railway. In addition to numerous small companies throughout the greater LA basin, Henry Huntington had gained control of both Redlands Central Railway and the San Bernardino Valley Traction Company. He sold his interest in all of these electric railways to Southern Pacific Railway in what is known as the Great Merger of 1911. Each of them was now part of one big Pacific Electric Railway. So you can see it here, and it went all over. And that brings us to our third poll, which is, at its peak, how many miles of track did Pacific Electric boast of having in Southern California? Was it 500, 1,000, 5,000, or 10,000? Oh, this is pretty good. We've got all kind of different ideas coming along. They even boasted, I think, that they were the largest interurban railway company in the world. Okay, I'll give you a couple seconds more. Okay. If you said 1,000 miles, you are correct. 1,000 miles is a long way. If you consider that Redlands to downtown LA is what, like 60, 65 miles, something like that. That's a lot of track all the way through Southern California. And you pretty much, anywhere you needed to go, you could get to on Pacific Electric. So here you can see close up, after connecting the Redlands lines to the greater PE line, all the different places that you could go in town that loop through Southwest Redlands, the line all the way up to the Country Club, the Brookside Avenue, Citrus Avenue line, and then up Orange Street, across San Bernardino Avenue, and all the way back up into San Bernardino. I love this photo because you can see in the center is what's called a single truck Bernie car that's being operated by PE. And we are at the intersection of Citrus Avenue, which is going left to right, and Orange Street, which is going kind of up and down in the picture. And the big brick building in the background was built is the YMCA and opened in 1894. That's, of course, where the Redlands Public Library started in 1894. And it became the City Hall offices as well. And on the right side of this picture with the big flagpole that's the triangle. So it's that funky little piece of land that was left over when the Cajon Street, Garden Street, and Citrus Avenue intersection was created because you had three streets coming in at different angles. So it left that little triangle of land. And that's pretty much where all the streetcar lines kind of centrally met. So you could get there to get anywhere you needed to go in town. And then we have this great video that shows one of those single truck Bernie cars coming north on Cajon Street with the Fox Theater in the background. There was some talk in about 1920 of extending the PE line down Brockton Avenue to University Street so that students and faculty and staff could get to the university by streetcar, but that line was never built. Occasionally, Redlands would see these large interurban cars. They're big, and they're intended to travel the long distances between cities as opposed to having the small city cars, which provided local service. Here's the car with a sign for Redlands, waiting in San Bernardino. Well, by the 1920s, PE was already feeling the pressure of competition created by the automobile, and some routes started to be abandoned. By the time this map was created in 1933, all the local lines except the Smiley Heights line had been abandoned, as you can see in the close-up. And then by 1936, even the Smiley Heights line wasn't profitable enough to continue. So here's the announcement that the last day of service would be July 19th, 1936. Now let's shift a little bit, talking about all the different things that made Redlands, without one of which we would have no Redlands. So if there's no railroad, then there's no way to ship fruit quickly and in large quantity, and without those, there's no Redlands. Now here you can see some wagons loaded with empty field boxes, ready to go back into the fields, having been run. But can you imagine if you have a large crop and you need to take it to, say, Los Angeles to sell? Well, you certainly couldn't take it on wagons like this. You have to have something like the railroad. So while getting things to the packing houses, it was okay you needed a way to ship things much more quickly and in much greater quantity. So here's another shot. All of these packing houses then, of course, are built along the rail lines. Here you can see the Elephant Orchards Company along the Santa Fe route. This is from a position just to the west of today's Eureka Street. That's the north side of Eureka between the railroad tracks and Stewart, where you see Elephant Orchards. I wish this photograph, the photographer had turned a little bit to his right, or her right, because then we could have seen Chinatown, would have been right there. But you can see the number of cars, and of course the refrigerated cars that are there waiting to be loaded with fruit, and of course at some point ice. Here's a look at downtown Redlands as it was in 1915, and you can see just how many rail lines crossed downtown, and all of the structures that were built to accommodate buildings that required access to the rail. Because anything that was of sufficient size or weight came into town on a train. Here we are back in downtown. You can see Redlands Co-op in the background, as well as another packing house along the Santa Fe line. And what's really interesting about this film is I'd never thought about how boxcars were loaded with fruit packed for shipping until I saw this film. Notice that the boxes are stacked vertically on their ends so as not to crush the fruit inside. And here's the train on its way, perhaps to Los Angeles, or maybe all the way to the East Coast, with its great convoy of Redlands gold, the Washington Naval Orange. Of course, people used it for transportation, and it's the important way if you needed to do business in Los Angeles or other major cities, and everybody used it. So you can see here a ticket that was held by Aaron Leipzig, who operated stores downtown, Myron Crafts, the founder of Crafton on the bottom left, John Alfred Kimberly of Kimberly Crest on the top, and of course the Kimberly-Clark Paper Company, and Redlands co-founder Ed Judson. Turning now from agriculture to tourism, remember, no trains, no tourism, no Redlands. As mentioned, the Chamber of Commerce was organized to promote railroad excursions to Redlands. Well, just over a year later, 2 individuals arrived with the intent to spend their winters here, and they helped literally put Redlands on the tourist map. And of course, they're Albert and Alfred Smiley. So Santa Fe, in its kite-shaped track promotional literature wanted to speak of the glories of all the things that you could see on their kite-shaped track excursions. And when you get to Redlands, here's what the inside looks like. It says it takes you through Redlands, noted for its beautiful villas and its orange groves. Smiley Heights and Canyon Crest Park are located in its suburbs. Never really thought of that as a suburb, but it's in Redlands suburbs. And the view to be had from their commanding position amid the bloom and fragrance of gardens and groves is worthy an extended visit. A little bit later, piece of promotional literature. Of course, no scene twice seen, because it was basically a figure 8, and that's what gave the name the kite, because it was sort of shaped like a kite. And of course, this is an artistic rendition that takes out a lot of the hinder and yawn of the rail line as it goes through, but it gives you an idea of how you could do this entire trip through Greater Southern California and never see the same things twice. Pasadena high school students Edith Parker and Ethel Burt were given a trip around the kite as a graduation gift in 1899. The two recorded their journey, titling it Two Girls and a Kite, which was published in Redlands in the 1980s. Parker, who later moved to Redlands and became Edith Parker Hinckley, nicknamed her friend KF, which stood for Kodak Fiend. Of Redlands, she wrote, "Redlands, Redlands, sing, O muse, a city beautiful for situation, whose broad streets are lined with golden oranges and whose flowers and fruit have ever excelled their praises. Just as Cicero said he would not mention the noble qualities of Arceus, so I am not going to tell of the fine climate, the location, the enterprise of the residences of Redlands, but the library must not be passed without a glance. Its stone columns, mosaic floor, carved stairway, and beautiful busts make it without peer in Southern California. In fact, all the public buildings are exceptionally fine, but Smiley Heights, KF and I thought we were hardened to everything living in California, but here our English failed completely, and we could only call it wunderschön. This beautiful Canyon Crest Park is on a long curving ridge a little out of Redlands, and all of its 200 acres is a bewildering labyrinth of trees, brilliant and rare flowers, and enticing little walks. The drive winds around among carnation beds with hundreds of blossoms, or by a hedge of honeysuckle overhung with weeping willows, or through the midst of palms and eucalyptus and birds of paradise in artistic confusion. Not the boldest magician in the Arabian Nights could have conceived the idea of making this fairyland out of the barren hill covered by only dry sagebrush that was here a few years ago." Well, Southern Pacific had to have its own tourist routes as well, so it created the Inside Track. And here you can see their route from LA all the way to Redlands and Crafton on the far east, with of course mentioning Smiley Heights as part of it. And inside, if you were to read, is of course photograph of Redlands in the mountains taken from Smiley Heights and mention of it inside. And in fact, if you look at any tourist literature for Southern California during the first 30 years of the 20th century, you will always find Redlands and Smiley Heights. So here's the Casa Loma, the library, Albert Smiley's residence in Smiley Heights, and the beautiful vista that you would find upon ascending to Smiley Heights. Pacific Electric itself had its own tourist specials out into our part of the country. And at first, they called it the Orange Belt Special. And when you arrive in Redlands, you could get a special upcharge ticket for a seat in the tally-ho around town that also took you over Smiley Heights. Later, they changed that to the Orange Empire Trolley Trip. And on the mainline trains that came through the canyon, Southern Pacific had its own promotional literature. And of course, with this beautiful colored plate of Santa Mateo Canyon near Redlands, and this is also a view from Smiley Heights. Well, the railroad was the site of many important things that went on over time. Here's a photo of Company G leaving Redlands during the Spanish-American War. Or how about an excursion in 1901 of Shriners who came to Redlands for a visit? And of course, we've been visited by a few presidents over the years. The first was William McKinley, who arrived here in May 1903. Here he is coming in on the Southern Pacific line. and then making his way out for a tour of our town. Theodore Roosevelt arrived on the Santa Fe line in May 1903 and waved a fond farewell to Redlanders on his way out. Well, at a regular meeting of the Chamber of Commerce that was held in March of 1906, we have this great letter, and the letter says that there was a general discussion at the meeting of the unattractive appearance and inconvenience of the Santa Fe Depot. It was suggested that it was the same depot with little change that was built in 1887, that Redlands has entirely outgrown it, that the business given by our people to the Santa Fe Railroad was worthy of better accommodations. In short, Redlands deserved a better depot than this. So who was found to design the new depot? Okay, that brings us to our last poll. Who do you think designed Redlands' new Santa Fe Depot? Was it Arthur Brown Jr., Frank Lloyd Wright, Leon Armentrout, or T.R. Griffith? All important known architects. Of course, Redlands only will have the best. All right, this is pretty good. Voting continues. I'll give you guys a few more seconds. If you'd like to cast a ballot and haven't yet, now's the time. Okay, we'll call it quits there. Check it out. All right, so 36% of you said T.R. Griffith. Now, T.R. Griffith designed A.K. Smiley Public Library that was finished in 1898. He also designed the First National Bank of Redlands, but it was Arthur Brown Jr. who designed Redlands Santa Fe Depot. Now, Arthur Brown Jr. was part of the Bay Area firm Bakewell and Brown, which was selected to design a San Francisco City Hall because, of course, San Francisco City Hall had been destroyed during the 1906 earthquake. And this is the building that they designed to replace it. So only the best for Redlands. The new depot is 311 feet long, roughly a football field. And construction started in 1909. Here you can see all of the poured in place concrete. And it was finished in 1910. The original depot wasn't demolished. It was actually picked up and moved west to serve as a freight depot. And you can see that original depot on the far right side of this photograph here. It created a truly memorable place at which to arrive when you were visiting. And I love the Santa Fe sign on the easel that's on the lawn just to the left of the columns there, which was actually there at least until the 1970s. I have no idea what had happened to it. Somebody, I'm sure, has it hidden somewhere. And if you know who that is, we would love to have it for the museum. Just saying. The Santa Fe was a great partner with the city of Redlands for a long time. Here you can see the Redlands Horticultural and Improvement Society having a flower show within the long arcade of the depot. Even the Chamber of Commerce knew the importance of the new building, and it moved its headquarters from the Finney Block on Orange Street to a new building next to the brand new depot in 1912, and it was designed in a style obviously to match the depot itself. Daily passenger service, although it had been much reduced in the 1920s and 1930s, actually ended in 1938 when the Great Flood washed out the trestle bridge in Mentone. By the time the bridge was rebuilt, mail service was delivered to the city by truck. And because mail service was the last real passenger service coming into town, the need for daily passenger trips was ended. And so that was the end of that type of rail service into Redlands. Looking out into the San Mateo Canyon at the main line that comes up It's quite a steep grade between Redlands and Beaumont. And so you needed large locomotives with a lot of power to get up the Beaumont grade. This is called a cab forward locomotive. The cab forward locomotive was created, here you can see one in action coming up the Beaumont grade, because over the Sierra Nevada, there was a lot of snow a lot of the year, and it got very deep. So these snow sheds were built so that the trains wouldn't have to deal with so much snow clearing. But of course, when the smokestack is at the front of the locomotive, you pretty much asphyxiate the engineer and the firemen in the cab of the locomotive. So someone had the brilliant idea that if you turn that section around, you can have the engine crew on the front side, and they don't have to asphyxiate on their way through these long sheds and tunnels through the Sierra Nevada. This is some great footage that was made available to us by the late Jack Sessoms, and it's really, really a phenomenal record. Southern Pacific didn't actually build a significant station along the main line in San Mateo Canyon until 1924. The cost of the new station, including platforms, double tracking, and other work, was over $100,000. It was located at the intersection of Fern Avenue and the tracks, and it quietly opened on October 1st, 1924. A major celebration event for the official opening took place 10 days later. Sadly, the station was open less than 30 years and was razed in the 1950s. On December 31st, 1924, according to an article in the Facts, Redlands greeted joyfully and colorfully the first Golden State Limited trains to pass through this city. Met the trains at the main line station with pretty girls who distributed oranges and advertising matter and greeted all 115 passengers on the two sections of the Limited in a way that left a strong impression of Redlands with them and of their entrance into the producing section of the Golden State. Arthur Isham, Secretary of the Redlands Chamber of Commerce, planned for the presentation of oranges to every passenger on the train. This was carried out, and the exclamation of pleasure on the part of the passengers at being made the recipients of this courtesy were many and joyful. Many could not restrain their enthusiasm at being so heartily and so pleasantly welcomed to the Golden State. They asked many questions about Redlands and the Orange Belt, and almost in toto declared their intentions of coming back to the community which had so pleasantly received them. In addition to fruit and roses, each passenger received a large envelope containing a County of San Bernardino booklet, a map of Redlands City, 2 postcards of Redlands, a red folder descriptive of Redlands, a climate chart, and on the outside of the envelope attached thereto by a clip was a card, all stamped and ready for mailing to an Eastern friend, carrying a New Year greeting from the sender and from Redlands. This is some more great footage that Jack Sessoms made available to us. So here is a special excursion train in 1947 that was put together. And here's the train coming into town. You can see all of the orchard heaters or smudge pots coming along. There's what we call the Rondor building that's going to be a new brewery now. The 1888 Redlands Santa Fe Depot. And then of course arriving at the new 1910 Santa Fe Depot on the train. The train paused for people to get off and take photographs, and the conductor then waves passengers back on. The train leaves. I love the wigwag crossing signal there that was at the crossing at Orange Street. You can see it in motion. Coming through, of course, the packing houses and the other industrial enterprises that were located along the railroad tracks. Out in the land toward the university. Somebody lost their four-legged friend there. Looking up toward Crafton, and then coming into Mentone. There's the Mentone Heights Association and another wigwag crossing signal. And then the train comes back into Redlands on its way out of town. You can see Redlands Mutual Orange Association in the background, which is now going to become a food court, which is pretty exciting. In May 1966, Santa Fe ran a special train for a company picnic to Sylvan Park, using the beautiful stainless steel streamlined equipment of the post-World War II period. Andy Carlson captured these great photos of the train here in town. You could imagine the excitement that people must have felt at seeing something like this come into Redlands. And here's the train parked along Sylvan, and you can almost barely make out some of the buildings of the Sylvan Plunge on the left side across the road. So this is just west of University Street. Well, if you remember back into the Business Insider video at the beginning, by the 1950s and 60s, rail service was in the decline. And freight service was in the decline because more and more companies were shipping by tractor trailer, by truck. And so here we have the Southern Pacific Freight Depot, which was along the Southern Pacific tracks, not too far from Eureka Street. And by 1962, it wasn't needed anymore and was being demolished. The passenger depot, which had long since, of course, ceased real passenger service, was still here in this 1956 photo, but it was finally demolished in 1968. So here you can see the photo of a freight train coming into Redlands shortly before the depot was demolished. This is the space between the two buildings where the Finney Block on the left side, where the big billboard is, and then the building on the right side, which is now Citroen Restaurant. My clock is telling me that it's noon, so I better hurry up. The Redlands Depot had a ticket office in it for Santa Fe service until 1971, at which time Amtrak took over all of the passenger service of the Santa Fe, and Santa Fe no longer needed a ticket office in the Redlands Depot. There was still a Redlands cab company or a taxi company that was run out of the depot for a while, but then finally those offices were closed. And it was kind of the end of an era. No more passenger service to Redlands. There was no depot in Redlands. Here you can see a special train coming through at the end of the Freedom Train movement across the United States from 1976. This was taken in 1977 as the train was on its way back to Portland, Oregon, actually. So very little happened rail-wise between 1978 and now. Finally, we have some exciting new movement in the rail world, because if you have crossed the tracks at any point in Redlands in the last couple of months, you will see great things are happening. And finally, we will be connected again to Greater Los Angeles and Southern California with a rail link on the historic 1888 Santa Fe rail line with the new Aero service. So that's something that I'm very excited about as a trained person. We'll be able to go all kinds of places. Once, of course, it's safe again after this pandemic has been crushed, I hope. And one of the really exciting things about this is that the new owners of the Santa Fe Depot have decided that it's really, really important to preserve and restore, and are doing an absolutely unbelievable, phenomenal job making this kind of crown jewel, along with the library, of course, crown jewel of Redlands, what it deserves to be. And once again, when the Aero line comes in, you'll be able to step off the train and see this beautiful station as it was intended by Arthur Brown when it was finished in 1910. And that brings us full circle. So what is old is new again.